Okay, let's start with the section. So I will be very brief. I will not ask questions. I will try to maximize the time for the speakers to speak and for you to ask questions. So I will be, you will hear my voice very little. So we will start. So the three people is a very curious panel because all of them are in institutions right now that they are leaving. So this is like, it's a strange way to present them, but Laura Gamboa, who is for now until August, I guess, an assistant professor in the University of Utah, is going to Notre Dame. Juan Pablo Luna, who is a professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, is going to McGill. And then Paulina Ochoa, who is a professor in Haverford College, is going to the University of Virginia. So there you have the whole story. And each of them will have 20 minutes, and then we will collect questions at the very end of the presentations. Thank you.
So, thank you so much for the invitation, Carlos, Kim, all the people who have done the logistics. This is an awesome conference. Thank you so much. Today, I am going to present a very quick overview of my book, Resisting Backsliding, Opposition Strategies Against the Erosion of Democracy. And the book starts with a very simple puzzle. In the past few decades, we have seen the rise of what I call potential autocrats. These are presidents with a very low normative preference for democracy, willing to undermine democratic institutions in order to achieve a series of policy gains. Some of these presidents introduce legislation that undermines checks and balances, hinders free and fair elections, political rights, and civil liberties, effectively eroding democracy. Despite similarities, however, others try to do the same, but they fail. And the question is why? Why is that some of these potential autocrats successfully erode democracy while others fail? In order to answer this question, I conceptualize erosion of democracy in two stages. The first stage focuses on the likelihood that a potential autocrat attains power. What brings these leaders to office in the first place? The second stage focuses on the mechanisms that explain why, once in office, some of these executives successfully erode democracy while others fail. For the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the second stage, but I'll be happy to talk about the first stage in the Q&A if you have any questions. What I argue is that the strategies that the oppositions use and the goals they use them for are key to understand why is that some executives successfully erode democracy while others fail. The existing literature on democratic backsliding, you can split this existing literature on democratic backsliding in two buckets. The first bucket focuses mostly on sort of the structural conditions that bring these presidents to office. You are talking about state capacity, party system institutionalization, economic performance, and these are great explanations in trying to understand why is that some countries see the rise of these executives and others not. And you can add many more, actually. I should probably update this slide at some point because these keep coming out. The second type of literature that exists on this topic focuses on success and failure of these potential autocrats, but usually focuses on the executive, right? So the arguments they use have to do with the resources the executive has, whether the executive is popular or not, whether the executive is able to co-opt institutions or not, or whether the institutions the executive is trying to co-opt are weak or not. The strategies the executive uses, and more recently, we're seeing more about, there's a couple of papers about whether the executive has a normative preference for democracy or not, and then sort of whether the executive has international support. And I'm not saying these explanations are not important, certainly they matter, these things all matter, but I think they kind of assume that only weak authoritarian leaders fail. And I just don't think that that's necessarily the case. Because if we think about the erosion of democracy as a process rather than a one-shot game, we need to look beyond the executive, right? We need to think about sort of the struggle between the executive and the opposition, right? Which means that instead of focusing on the correlation of forces between government and opposition, what I try to do is I try to focus on the strategies the opposition uses and the goals they use them for. So this theory is entrenched in sort of the dynamics of democratic backsliding. I conceptualize erosion of democracy as a type of regime transition that happens over time. Like civilian or military coups, the erosion of democracy pushes a regime outside the democratic camp into the authoritarian camp. So what happens is these executives introduce legislation that slowly hinders horizontal accountability and accumulates over time until it hinders vertical accountability as well, making the electoral playing field incredibly uneven, such that it is impossible to defeat the incumbent. Unlike military or civilian coups, however, the erosion of democracy happens over time. It takes years for these executives to undermine democracy. This has mostly to do with the fact that these executives want to keep a democratic facade, right? They want to appear democratic to the world. So they want to hinder democratic institutions and advance their agenda, but they don't want to pay the price of overt attacks against democracy. So what they do is that they start to co-opt democratic institutions very slowly. And that takes time, right? And because the erosion of democracy takes time, that means that the opposition has a chance to fight back. So again, what I suggest here is that we look at the strategies and the goals that they use in this struggle to protect democracy. When we think about the opposition, I separate goals and strategies. So let me start with the goals. Oppositions or facing these kind of autocrats can have two kinds of goals. What I call radical goals, which is oppositions who try to remove the executive before the end, to stop anti-democratic reforms, like they try to remove the executive before the end of her constitutional term. Just keep in mind that all of these executives were democratically elected. So for me, oppositions that try to remove them before the end of their constitutional term are radical, have radical goals. But they could also have moderate goals, which means they're trying to check the executive, just trying to stop specific reforms without removing the executive. To achieve these goals, the opposition can use institutional strategies, meaning Congress, courts, or elections, or they can use extra institutional strategies, which means any kind of strategy that does not use Congress, courts, or elections. This is how the strategies and goals look like. Institutional strategies with moderate goals would be electioneering, legislating, lobbying, litigation. All of these are trying to stop specific reforms from institutional settings. Institutional strategies with radical goals would be things like recall referendums or impeachments that are trying to use the institutions to remove the executive from office. Extra institutional strategies with radical goals would be things like coups or guerrilla warfare, but they could also be protests, boycotts, or strikes that are trying to push the executive to resign. Now, protests, boycotts, or strikes could also be extra institutional strategies with moderate goals if they're not trying to push the executive to resign, but just like are fighting against specific reforms. Individually, neither goals or strategies are particularly detrimental for democracy. Combined, however, I think they can have very serious consequences for regime change. Before we start this, the tolerance for the executive actions and the ability of the executive to act while keeping a democratic facade depends to a certain extent on the challenge the opposition poses. Institutional strategies with moderate goals pose a small challenge. They acknowledge the existing channels of conflict resolution, and they allow for negotiation. They don't create a zero-sum game. In this sense, these kind of strategies decrease incentives to repress and increase the cost of doing so. Not only do they not attack the president personally, so like the president doesn't feel cornered, but they also hinder the ability of the executive to get legitimate reasons to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them. In this sense, institutional strategies with moderate goals are more likely to protect democracy. If they fail, if they don't stop the specific reforms, the opposition lives to fight another day. And if they succeed, well, they stop the erosion of democracy. These kind of strategies just hinder the ability of the executive to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them. And in doing so, they protect the ability of the opposition to fight from within Congress, protect courts and oversight agencies, and stop more aggressive anti-democratic reforms. Extra institutional strategies with radical goals would be the opposite. They present a very extreme challenge against the executive, right? They create a zero-sum game and they corner the president. And in doing so, they increase incentives to repress and they decrease the cost of doing so. Not only, again, do they corner the president who feels that it's me or them, but they also give the executive legitimate reasons to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them. In this sense, these kind of strategies are more detrimental for democracy. If they succeed, aka if a coup succeeds, you break democracy altogether. But if they fail, then you give the executive legitimate reasons to remove opposition leaders from key institutional positions. And in doing so, you hinder the ability of the opposition to protect courts and oversight agencies and stop more aggressive anti-democratic reforms down the road. Institutional strategies with radical goals and extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals fall somewhere in between. Institutional strategies with radical goals increase the incentives to repress, but they also increase the cost of doing so, right? They do corner the president. A president that is going to be impeached feels cornered. But at the same time, impeachments are legal, and the opposition is entitled to use them, right? So they don't necessarily provide the executive with legitimate reasons to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them. Extra institutional strategies with moderate goals decrease incentives to repress, but they also decrease the cost of doing so, right? Like these kind of strategies do not necessarily corner the president, but in certain circumstances, they could provide the executive with legitimate reasons to crack down on the opposition. In this sense, these kind of strategies could go either way. Impeachments or recalled referendums could corner the president, could remove the president from office and stop the erosion of democracy altogether. We go home. On the other hand, they could corner the president, and the president could feel legitimized and entitled to push for more aggressive anti-democratic reforms. Likewise, extra-institutional strategies with moderate goals can help, or like protests or boycotts or strikes that are trying to stop specific reforms can help provide visibility for the executive abuses. They can mobilize voters. They can help protect democratic institutions. But if they happen to have violence or happen to be illegal, they could provide the executive with legitimate reasons to crack down on the opposition. So in this way, these kind of strategies could go either way. So to summarize, because the erosion of democracy happens over time, the opposition has ample opportunities to fight back. If the opposition uses extra institutional strategies with radical goals and some kinds of institutional strategies with radical goals or some kinds of extra institutional strategies with moderate goals, they provide the executive with legitimate reasons to remove opposition leaders from office, prosecute, or jail them, and in doing so, they hinder the ability of the opposition to protect courts and oversight agencies and stop more aggressive anti-democratic reforms. On the other hand, if the opposition uses institutional strategies with moderate goals or some types of institutional strategies with radical goals, some kinds of extra institutional strategies with moderate goals, they're going to be better able to protect democracy. These strategies are not bulletproof. We can talk about the exceptions, but they provide a window of opportunity, right? They give the opposition a better chance to protect their seats in Congress and courts and oversight agencies, and in doing so, use these institutions to stop more aggressive anti-democratic reforms. In the book, I assess this argument using two cases: the case of successful erosion, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and a case of failed erosion, Álvaro Uribe in Colombia. In the book, I tell you I outline the specific mechanisms that allow the opposition to prevent the erosion of democracy using moderate institutional strategies and moderate extra institutional strategies, and hinder the ability to stop the erosion of democracy in Venezuela using extra institutional strategies with radical goals. Today, I'm not going to go in that much detail. I'm just going to give you an overview of these two cases. I analyze these cases using data, 88 interviews with politicians, judges, journalists, and other civil society actors, and many other people who was part of all this story. I also did archival research in newspapers and archival research in Congress. So let me start with Venezuela. Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 in the midst of a massive economic crisis. Very quickly after, by the time, these are not the slides I sent, but that's fine. Very quickly after he attained power, he conducted 3 power grabs. In 1999, he called for a constitutional assembly in which he had a majority of the seats. In 2000s, he called for elections across the board. And in 2001, he introduced a series of decrees that threatened property rights. Altogether, these power grabs decrease the size of Congress, enhance the executive's hold over military promotions, and changed sort of the balance of oversight agencies, though I don't think it quite allowed Chavez to co-opt them, but it did change the balance of some oversight agencies. And it allowed Chavez to gain majorities in Congress, and they allowed Chavez to increase his time in office by being able to get reelected once. That being said, In 2001, democracy in Venezuela was not dead. The 1999 Constitution kept a good chunk of the 1961 Constitution intact, and in many ways, at least on paper, a lot of these oversight agencies and courts and oversight agencies actually had more power than they did before. Not only that, but the opposition had plenty of resources in 2001. They had 48% of the seats in Congress, a strong presence in PDVSA, the oil company in Venezuela, sympathizers in the armed forces, some supporting courts and oversight agencies, the support of media outlets and media outlet owners, and they had the ability to mobilize millions of Venezuelans to the streets. Yet, using extra institutional strategies with radical goals, they actually ended up losing all of these resources. These kind of strategies diminished the opposition's support inside and outside the country, diminished the opposition's international legitimacy, and allowed the government to remove opposition members from key institutions without losing its democratic facade. The first one of these strategies was a failed coup in 2002. Although the coup was really short-lived, like 3 days, the coup had very serious consequences for regime change. Not only did it decrease the opposition's legitimacy outside and increase support for Chavez, but more importantly, it allowed Chavez to purge the armed forces. Chavez had the information and the legitimacy he needed to remove several members of the armed forces. By September 2002, 200 officers had been removed, dismissed, or demoted, and 4 officers were in trial for betrayal. Just like that, the opposition lost their sympathizers in the armed forces. The next move was a indefinite strike organized at the end of 2002 that lasted all the way until January of 2003. Originally, the strike was organized by PDVSA members, and the idea of this strike was to kind of fight a series of reforms that Chavez wanted to introduce, but they felt too strong on the streets. So they figured out they could just hold on and push Chavez to resign, and to a certain extent, they almost succeeded. Yet Chavez had control of the military, so what he did is he took the military, he used them to put PDVSA back up and running, and by January, the strike just vanished, right? The strike failed, and even though it did not quite increase support for Chavez, it had really serious consequences for the opposition. It decreased the opposition legitimacy inside the country. It allowed Chavez to remove like 60% of PDVSA employees without losing any. Oh God, okay. Just like that, the opposition lost its support, its presence in PDVSA. After the strike, the opposition had been negotiated on a table organized by the OEAS and the Carter Center. Because when the opposition was organizing the strike, the opposition was very strong and they were pushing for a recall referendum. After the strike faded, they were no longer able to push for this strike referendum. They had to settle for what the government had offered all along, which was a recall referendum. Sorry, they were pushing for early elections. In 2004, the government actually was able to push the referendum back in time all the way to 2004. By then, oil prices were up. The government controlled PDVSA. They were able to finance and get a bunch of programs that increased support for the government. Chavez won that referendum, which takes me to the third movement. Instead of taking the referendum and just gearing up for the parliamentary elections of 2005, the opposition called for a legislative boycott in 2005. This legislative boycott, as you can imagine, also backfired. Not only did it decrease the legitimacy of the opposition, both inside and outside the country, but more seriously, it gave the government 100% Chavista National Assembly. And with that 100% Chavista National Assembly, not only did the opposition lose their presence in Congress, they also lost the support in courts and oversight agencies because the government was able to co-opt them. And eventually, I don't have it in the slide, they also lost control over media outlets as well. Let me go really quickly to the Colombia case before they kick me out of here. Like Hugo Chavez, Álvaro Uribe was authoritarian, populistic, and very much willing to undermine democratic institutions in order to achieve his policy goals. As soon as he came to power, he introduced reforms to undermine Congress, undermine the courts, enhance his powers of decree, reform oversight agencies, and extend his time in office not 1, but 2 times. The opposition to Álvaro Uribe was significantly weaker than the opposition in Venezuela. They had roughly 30% of the presence in Congress, some supporting courts and oversight agencies to the extent that these were independent, the ability to mobilize some Colombians, but not nearly as many as Venezuela. They did not have support inside the armed forces and definitely did not have the control over major media outlets. Though this is not to say that all of the media outlets were co-opted by the government, but they definitely did not have access to major media outlets. Yet, unlike what happened in Venezuela, the opposition in Colombia avoided extra institutional strategies with radical goals, which allowed them to effectively use international forums, broaden their coalition in Congress, and protect seats in Congress, courts, and oversight agencies. By the time Álvaro Uribe stepped down, the opposition had roughly the same resources they had started with. They even had enhanced their presence in Congress. Not only did the opposition fail to use extra institutional strategies with radical goals, but they also effectively used moderate institutional strategies and moderate extra institutional strategies. They obstructed legislation in Congress, they created and denounced procedural irregularities, and they organized protest boycotts against a specific reform. Altogether, these strategies allow the opposition to modify reforms, so tame down some of the reforms introduced by the government, increase public scrutiny, decreasing support for some of the reforms, provide the Constitutional Court with resources to rule against some of the more outrageous anti-democratic reforms, enhance the institution's legitimacy, and even stop some of the reforms, like the electoral boycott actually stopped a referendum that would have decreased the size of Congress very early in Álvaro Uribe's government. At the end of the day, the opposition in Colombia was able to tame down some of these reforms that threatened Congress, courts, and oversight agencies. It was able to stop the anti-terrorist statute, and it ended up with the Álvaro Uribe's second re-election reform. Altogether, I think the book makes three important contributions. The first contribution is it actually shows that the erosion of democracy is avoidable even after a potential autocrat attains power. It highlights the importance of opposition agency in processes of democratic backsliding, and it identifies which strategies and goals help or hinder the erosion of democracy. The book also leaves important questions for those trying to think about dissertations. The first one is we need more research on the scope conditions of the argument. Under what circumstances this work? How is that these strategies play out in different contexts? And we also need more research on the drivers of these opposition strategic choices. And yes, I'm working on it, and I'll be happy to talk about that project during the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation, Carlos, Kim, also for the organization. I'm trying to find, where is it? There it is. Thanks so much. Okay. So this is unfortunately not a book, and it won't be a book. It's just some random ideas about the topic of the conference and the topic I was invited to speak on. And I try to be provocative and exchange that for the coherency of the argument and how good these ideas are. So bear with me. I'll try to be brief in any case. So when we look at Latin America, and in particular when we look at systems of representation in Latin America, we see a series of structural trends that I think have some novelty to them, right? The first part, I mean, and this is not that novel, we see a lot of political party destruction, right? Since the 1990s, since the early 1980s, Latin America has destroyed its historical party systems, right? This has happened more rapidly in some cases than others, but it's almost universal to the region. The second trend, and this is or was somewhat unexpected at some point, is the fragility and evanescence of new parties. A lot of new parties are created in Latin America. More than 300 political parties were created since the transitions to democracy until this day. only a few of those parties remain in place as we speak, right? And if we, for instance, apply the criteria proposed by Levitsky et al. For counting successful parties, you find like 4% of those 300 parties that were created in the region surviving today, right? So essentially what you see in the region is more the alignment without realignment than we are used to expect in the analysis of political party systems, right? So instead of successful, durable, top-down realignments via populist governance, or instead of generative polarization, I'm mentioning here Adrien Levat's concept for Africa, in which he describes processes in which polarization leads to party building and party institutionalization in Africa. You don't see much of that in the region. Successful realignments have occurred and are occurring in the region, but they occur essentially via authoritarian drifts, right? One could argue, for instance, that what's going on in El Salvador today might produce a new a realignment of the party system in the future. That type of realignment has been essentially the consequence of authoritarian drifts. I have data to show this and to illustrate these trends, but I won't bore you with the details. This comes from my joint work with Gerardo Munk that was published in 2002. I think. This is kind of party destruction in the region, and this is party creation in the region. These were the only cases that we were able to identify that satisfied Levitsky et al. Criteria for counting successful parties in the region. And if you look at the table and some of the examples I have there, for instance, you see the case of El Salvador, in which you have Arena and the FMLN, they are both gone today, right? So even those that, and that's the case for many other political parties that were created in the region in this period. The PRD in Mexico is another instance. Many of the Chilean parties that were created there are in serious trouble, and so on and so forth. How we interpret in the last decade or 2 decades this type of political change, or what has been occurring in terms of systems of representation in Latin America in the last 20 years. I would say one of the main issues in the literature has been ideological cycling, right? We first looked at the neoliberal turn, right? Sometimes tied to Collor, Menem, and Fujimori's neo-populism style. Then out of nowhere came the left turn. We analyzed the left turn. Then came another cycle to the center right, a liberal business type right. Then came a new left, right? More based on identity than on a populist or social democratic left. And these 2 last cycles I mentioned were kind of shyer than the ones we had before. And now we are discussing the extreme right and like the arrival of the extreme right, along with polarization, which has become the new mantra, right? I'm sorry if this is a bit polemic, but the US started to get worried about polarization. We have all these people working on polarization, and everyone is seeing polarization everywhere in all places and times, right? And we are all trying to measure polarization. and the relationship between polarization, populism, and so on. So what I think we might be missing, and this is where the argument is very tentative, is that this cycling that we have observed in the region has become increasingly compressed in time. You see switches more and more often to one place to the other, right? And this is the cycling that has destroyed or that underlies the destruction of the party systems of the region. The only partial exception to this in terms of like long-term perspective has to do with the commodity boom years, in which you have economic growth, in which you have the implementation of CCTs, for instance, and some social incorporation, and that provided stability to the left turn in particular. Some of what I think it's a bit inconsistent is that if you have polarization, at least in some versions of what polarization has come to mean, you should observe some stability in the alignments in terms of voting behavior and in terms of the supply and demand of political representation. Indeed, in some of the most stable cases of the region, you observe polarization. Arena and FMLN in El Salvador, the Peronistas versus the PRO in Argentina, right? And something that has happened in both of those cases is that that polarization that we thought provided stability to these party systems was completely gone or recrafted by outsiders that swamp the system and throw the two poles away. Another thing that we usually expect, if you look, for instance, at the work of Ken Roberts, Jennifer McCoy, etc., Carlos has worked on this too in the literature on populism, you expect to see a realignment from above when outsiders come to power and implement a populist strategy. But my sense is that that realignment from above has become more and more difficult to pursue, even for electorally successful populists, right? Why might this matter? In a democracy, political representation entails two things, right? If you are a successful political representative in a democracy, you have to do two things. You have to stretch time, right, to synchronize people's urgent needs and demands with the timing of public policies, right? And you have to stretch the time horizons of the citizenry in order to remain legitimate, right? If you don't stretch time, you lost your legitimacy. And at the same time, you have to simplify space. There are many conflicts in society. There are many grievances that can structure the political system. But what successful systems of political representation do is to simplify that space, to reduce that space to one or two dimensions, right? This is like factor analysis for those of you who are trained in all the statistics. In contemporary society, and in contemporary Latin American society, what we see is that time has compressed. If you look at the popularity of presidents, there is an exercise there, an empirical exercise there. I just compared how many months did the first three presidents in every country in the region rule before seeing their popularity decline by 10%. And that was an average of 50 months at the beginning of the transitions to democracy. These are like 17 countries I put in this computation. If you look at the three last presidencies in the region in each of those countries and compute how many months they last before declining 10% in popularity, and this is obviously an arbitrary threshold, you see an average of 10 months, right? So you come to office and you are basically a lame duck. So you had like 50 months without seeing your popularity decline on average. Now you have 10 months. Right? This is in some ways indicates how difficult it has become for political leadership to stretch time, right? And this creates problems with legitimacy in my view. Obviously, there are many other presidents that can stretch time, but when they do, they usually do it through an authoritarian drift. And the second thing is that space has bifurcated, right? You have an explosion of conflicts at the local level, at the national level, that the political systems of the region have a hard time in terms of vertebrating and articulating and simplifying. So either you have massive political discontent, in many cases at the local level, right? If you look at, for instance, protests in Latin America around neo-extractivism, they remain usually local. They often are encapsulated locally. They cannot be aggregated and represented nationally, except for some specific instances. Or you have massive protesting that the political system fails to articulate and vertebrate. However, this is not a Latin American phenomenon. This is something that has become a feature of democratic politics all over the place, right? And I know I have to include Sumac here, and so this is there's a bit of cherry picking here. But if you look at, for instance, Britain in terms of time compression, this is how much time did prime ministers in Britain lasted, right? And you see, I mean, again, a difficulty in terms of stretching the time horizons of the people. So in sum, and to just finish up with what I think it's particular of Latin America, you see shorter and shorter cycles among or cycling among more fragile, and that is less legitimate democratic leadership. Those leaders can be strident, they can polarize to win elections, but in my view, they are being less able to govern and to sustain that electoral legitimacy once they govern while sticking to liberal democratic institutions. There are endogenous causes to this, right? Party systems and political systems can become more fragmented, so it's much more difficult to bring together a coalition once you govern. And they step also on shaky grounds. Essentially, I mean, electoral mobilization entails putting together a broad but highly segmented and usually negative electoral coalition, right? This is there in quotes a sentence by a political candidate I talked to some time ago. He said, "Las borracheras electorales generan una resaca enorme." ¿No? So you get drunk with what you get on Sunday night, Monday morning, you are in deep trouble. Of course, there are exceptions as well. What is then particular to Latin America of all this, and why I think might be important to highlight in terms of the dynamics you see in the region? I think there are two structural conditions. I just mentioned endogenous conditions that have to do with the structure of political competition. I think there are two structural conditions which are exogenous to the party system and the political system that make it somewhat different in Latin America, and if you ask me, a bit more complicated. One has to do with, we have weaker states, and this has to do with weak states that have become weaker in relation to challenges such as those posed by organized crime today, which are infiltrating political systems, corrupting institutions, like creating something that with Andreas Feldman we just called tentatively criminal politics, right? But this also has to do with historical weaknesses of Latin American states, and also with new, with changes in the political economy of the region that has to do with, for instance, dynamics associated to neo-extractivism, to big tech companies that become more and more able to leverage information and data and impose conditions on states that were unprecedented or are unprecedented. And then the second thing, I think it's inequality in terms of income has decreased a bit in Latin America. As was mentioned before, this is associated also with an increase in discontent, right? I mean, when you see and when you are able to politicize those inequalities, it's especially when inequalities are decreased a bit. But at the same time, we have highly fragmented and segmented societies along functional and territorial spaces, right? And this complicates in important ways the capacity of politicians, of political parties to mobilize and sustain mobilization around things like encompassing public goods. Right? If you look at back in time, like programmatic party mobilization had to do with large constituencies that were mobilized around the provision or against the provision of public goods, right? We have societies in which public goods, encompassing public goods, are no longer there. This is just to put a picture on what I'm trying to convey. There are 7 minutes between these two spaces. And this is metropolitan Santiago, arguably the strongest state in the region, the most developed socioeconomic society in Latin America. I can take anyone from the places we do field work now to the financial district in 7 minutes. The people who live in this shanty town, most of them, those who work in the formal economy, work here. The people who live in neighborhoods like this have a much greater chance to go to the airport than to ever encounter a space like this in their life or lifetime. And this that I just showed you with Santiago. This is an exercise we did with Rodrigo Medel, trying to map citizens' perceptions in terms of access to social, political, and civil rights. And what you see in Latin America is enormous segmentation, right? And partial access to things like what we often think of as civil citizenship rights, social citizenship rights, and political citizenship rights, right? For the region, this is like all the countries included in the Americas barometers. From 2012 to 2016, you see only 15% of respondents claiming that they feel entitled to full citizenship rights in Latin America. Can I take 2 minutes to wrap up? 1? Okay. To try to put a name of what I'm trying to describe here is, instead of populism and polarization, perhaps yet, right? In some countries in Latin America, what we are seeing today is what Barrenechea and Vergara have described for Peru as a powerless democracy. A democracy in which you have permanent cycling, no one can exercise power, right? And no successful leader has been able to polarize or reshuffle the system in ways that provide some stability and a structure to political representation. So I just wanted to like put this alternative to the other two more popularly debated on the table for what it's worth. I had some illustration of that for Chile. We don't have time for that. I think two more things and I close, Christian. One is that I think we should focus more on what Masuka calls exercise of power and a bit less in terms of access to power, right? The problems we are seeing has to do more with, or have to do more with, how these people govern and the capacity they have to exercise power than what we see in terms of access to power. But obviously you have feedback effects on that. And I think it's important we realize that besides complaining about what we have lost, like political parties that are not coming back, right? There's no way, right? Structural conditions are not there, right? We do not know much in terms of how to make liberal democracy compatible with the structural conditions that have consolidated in recent decades in Latin America. In this structural playing ground, the right wins even by default, right? They have better political marketing, easier narratives to win elections, higher balance and credibility on issues that the popular sectors care more about. Against a troubled present and a shadowy future, the right is much better at selling a false return to the past, right? No one is seeing a future in Latin America. The right, it's essentially selling you an order that was lost and that was better than the presence we have. And that's it. And the left doesn't know anything about how to deal with this. So thanks and good luck.
Okay. So I was going to start by saying, and now for something completely different, because it is, but now actually I found some echoes because I'm also talking about time. So there might be more possibilities of conversations that I thought there would be. So let me go to the next one. Okay, I'm doing it again, even though you told me how to do it. Here it goes. Yeah, I got it. Thank you. So a couple of weeks ago, in February 18th, there was a massive March for Democracy in Mexico City. So the demonstration opposed constitutional reforms that are proposed by the current president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So in the demonstrators' views, these reforms undermine democracy. And they do so because they undermine independent institutions, notably the judiciary, electoral authorities, and the institutions that protect access to government information and the independence of the civil service. However, the president and his party and the reforms, they all remain very popular. And this is not only because the reforms constitutionally raise the minimum wage and they reform the pension plan and make it more generous. It is also because the president's followers believe that the demonstrators, and this is a quote, are using the colors of the referee to defend a partisan position. So the followers of the president claim that the supposed March for Democracy and Institutions is in fact a campaign act of the opposition, whose main interest is to defend the privileges of the old political elite. So in the president's party view, the opposition is flexing muscles to defend institutions that favor neoliberal politics, technocratic elites, and minority privileges. So these two views come across very clearly in the proposed reforms to the Supreme Court. The president's proposal is to have the justices elected by popular vote. For the opposition, this is a surefire way of giving all the power to the president because he's known to manipulate elections. However, in the popular discourse, this sounds very democratic, and it allows the president to say that now the people are going to protect popular sovereignty. So the president asserts that in a democracy, the majority has the right to reform institutions, as they do. And in his view, it is disingenuous to hold that the independent institutions are impartial referees, because institutions also occupy partisan positions. So the opposition, in turn, believes that the party in government has captured the state, disabled institutions that sustain pluralism and democracy. Now, full disclosure, I very much favor the second position, the one in opposition now. But I think it has serious theoretical problems and serious PR problems. They are not helping the cause of those who depend on independent institutions in Mexico. And for that matter, I think this can be extended for those who try to defend independent institutions in Turkey, in Hungary, and Argentina, in the United States, and elsewhere. So for the sake of clarity, instead of talking about the two parties in Mexico, I will call this second group the institutionalists. And those who defend a position similar to Mexico president, I will call them populists. There are all sorts of caveats, of course, but it's just to distinguish them. Now, the institutionalist problem is that once the trust in institutions has been damaged due to a constitutional crisis or a very close election, you decide, the institutionalists do not have a very good answer to the objections of the populists who say that the supposed neutrality of democratic institutions is in fact a partisan position and is not a defense of the common good or the popular will. So unless they command an overwhelming majority of the electorate, the institutionalists cannot shake off the accusation that they are just a minority defending their privileges. So when institutionalists are in the minority, they often claim that there is backsliding, which means that institutionalism is on the side of democratic progress. It is on the right side of history. So I think this is a terrible strategy to defend democracy. And today I will argue that there are at least 3 historical and theoretical reasons why institutionalists should not rely on the notion of progress to defend their position. Now, this is a talk in the history of political thought, and it's mainly critical. So I'm going to go to the 16th century, but I promise I will come back to the 21st century at the end and offer an alternative to what I'm talking about. Now, the first reason why there is a bad idea to talk about backsliding, it's because it associates institutionalisms with neoliberalism. Now, I will explain all the connection, but before I get there, do you know what backsliding means? Backsliding, it's actually about apostasy. It is a religious term. It means relapsing, become an apostate, to turn your back of God, to embrace sin. That's what backsliding is. So clearly, political scientists use this term secularly and metaphorically. In political science, of course, you're about to tell me it only means de-democratization. It doesn't mean anything else. But actually, the religious structure of the concept carries with the metaphor. So, for example, in religion, what counts as good is clear because it's revealed. There is one path to the goal, and the path and the goal are good. Now, that's how you know there's progress. But it's not so much in political science, where saying that democracy is good should require further argument. Yet we use the term backsliding because it introduces a moral goal and saves the work of actually arguing for it. Backsliding tells you that there is a set goal and the goal is good. And in so doing, it also introduces the notion of historical progress. So, historical progress, it is true, has also been secularized for centuries. Since the 18th century, social scientists have tried to explain authority and human development without the help of revelation. Enlightenment thinking turned human reason, let me get you your progress here. Enlightenment thinking turned human reason into the ground of ethics and used the rational capacity of humans as the basis of political equality. So this became the leading way of legitimizing authority in modernity. But with this ethical ground to politics also came an unwarranted hope for progress, which gave rise to what historians call Whig history. That is the idea that reason is somehow embedded in history and that history moves in the direction of rational progress. So the arc of history, etc. In the case of democratic progress, also since the 18th century, this became very closely connected with economic growth. So this is clear when the version of reason that underlies ethics and politics, it's equivalent to self-interest. So many theories of politics at the time that Whig history was coming into its own argued that self-interest could collectively lead towards broader social goods, ensuring progress for everyone. So think of Mandeville's The Fable of the Beast. Private vices lead to public benefits. And also that rational self-interest and economic gain alone could be the engine of historical progress. So in Adam Smith's Lectures in Jurisprudence, he argued that a society progresses through different stages of economic development. So you go from nomadic to pastoral to agricultural and finally to commercial society. And this happens because there are rational decisions that are conditioned by the material circumstances of each stage that create the conditions for the coming into being of the next stage. If you know your Marx, you know where he got it from, okay? So this means that he did not need a religious revelation. He needed reason alone to explain economic progress. Now, individual decisions connect self-interest to economic growth and also to the moral achievements of each country. This is because in Adam Smith's view, economic growth connects to liberal principles such as freedom and equality. So for Smith, the rule of law is connected to development because what the rule of law does is secure private property. And so it sustains economic growth and liberal government eventually. So reason alone can explain growth, and it can also legitimize democratic government. And the whole story seems to guarantee that there will be future progress. Now, Enlightenment views then connect economic growth to political progress. In the 20th century, well, lots of things happened in the 19th century, but I'm not going to bore you with all of that as well. So I'll just jump to the 20th century. This connection between economic growth and moral progress became even tighter through development theory. Democratic progress became closely associated with capitalist economic growth in everywhere, but in Latin America particularly. A great example of this connection is in W.W. Rostow's Stages of Economic Growth. So in this book, Rostow described the stages through which any society has to go through to attain technological maturity, as he called it. This is a natural and necessary process with a clear direction. For Rostow, democracy emerged naturally and necessarily to guarantee capitalist economic growth. And it was this type of theory that motivated and conditioned economic aid and exerted all that political pressure that came to Latin America from the US and international economic institutions after World War II. This, of course, culminated with the Washington Consensus at the turn of the century. And so it is not surprising that when many people hear backsliding, especially if they're in the political elites, they also hear echoes of financial capitalism, globalism, and mid-century USA holding hands with the IMF and the World Bank. saying backsliding brings with it progress and all its baggage. So the theoretical reason for not using the term backsliding is that it smuggles an unwarranted normativity that has not been argued for. And the first prudential reason is that backsliding establishes an ideological connection to neoliberalism. Now, the second reason, signal when I'm getting there. The second reason is that backsliding is associated with elitism and ethnic social hierarchies. This is why we should avoid backsliding as well. It associates you with elitism. A defensive institution often says that this is the rational way of organizing politics. The democratic institutions, because a rational individual would realize that were he on the side of the losers in an election, he would have the rights protected, so he will get a chance to see another day, right, to compete again. To this, the populist may reply that in practice, what matters is not whose ideology more closely aligns with justice or with rationality, but who does in fact hold power. Whomever commands institutions will say that they have reason on their side anyway. But the institutionally points out that without neutral institutions, there cannot be electoral politics. And if the populists cannot grasp this ideal, it must be because they don't understand the difference between the ideal and the practice. If you notice, institutionalism often frames disagreement as a conflict between those who understand and those who lack rational capacity. So the assumption will often be that people who support the populists lack capacity because they are stupid or uneducated or ignorant. Historically, the institutionalists frame those people not as bad or as evil, not even as enemies, but as uncivilized or primitive. Although people often think that their enemies are bad people in the history of humankind, seeing them as primitive, it's actually a modern invention that came to be in Latin America. Cool things that we create in our region. So since early colonial days, Spanish colonizers had an ethical, well, they had lots of ethical problems, but they confronted what they thought was an ethical problem. They said, or at least they believed, this is what they told themselves, that they believed in the common humanity and equal moral standing of the Christian Europeans with the Indians. That's why they wanted to evangelize them. But they obviously also wanted to dominate the natives. So there's a bit of a clash here. The way in which they succeeding in holding these contradictory ideas in their minds and in their laws was to claim that all the groups were morally equal, but some were further behind in their way to moral progress. So moral progress, where some people are behind and others are ahead in their development, allowed them to establish a hierarchy of groups and justify paternalism towards the groups who were considered to be primitive, retrograde, or underdeveloped. So as you can see, this is the part of this history of calling savages or primitives all those people who stand in the way of the plans of the humanists or the enlightened elites. So a clear example of how this played out since colonial days can be found in the work of José de Acosta. You might not know him. He's a 17th century Jesuit. Let me get to him now here. He's a 17th century Jesuit. And what Acosta did is like he has this amazing natural history of the Indies, but it's the introduction of the idea of nature, and it's quite interesting in that respect. But now I'm just focusing on this part where he compares European Christians, the Chinese and the Japanese, the Nahua or the Aztecs and the Inca, and those people who lived in small groups in the periphery of the empires, like the Chichimeca, which are the desert nomads to the northern plains of North America. So for Acosta, the most meaningful differences were in rational development. The Chichimeca are like children in relation to the more developed Nahua. The Aztecs are much more developed, they're still ignorant. They still must be subordinated to European conquerors and taught civilized Christian faith and European norms. So Acosta classified people along this temporal continuum of human progress, even though they lived exactly in the same present, but it allowed them to establish hierarchies while claiming to endorse the principles of equality. So I refer to early colonial times because for all the changes in the 17th century, we see today the same pattern when a group appeals to progress to defend their position. In doing so, they reduce those who don't agree with them to children that need either education or scolding, rather than political antagonists. And those who look down the path of progress clearly feel superior to the primitives. The idea of backsliding is ideologically associated with elitism, particularly with those ethnic groups that the urban elites consider primitive. And not surprisingly, those groups do not like it. Okay, so this is the third reason. Using progress and backsliding prevents institutionalists from taking responsibility of their normative positions. So all the historical pedigree of the idea of progress and backsliding, there is no scientific reason to hold that history has a direction or that politics tends naturally towards democracy. Moreover, the fact that in the past there has been a historical connection between democratic institutions and economic growth in some countries is not a guarantee that the connection is causal. And if there were such causal connection, it is not clear what is the direction of causality. And given that capitalist economic development seems to lead to ecological catastrophe, it's not obvious that economic growth is the right ethical direction either. So why should we assume that institutionalists are more progressive than populists? How do we know that there is progress and regress? The short answer is that we do not. We do not know that there is such a thing. There are two positions, and we have different normative reasons to suppose one or the other. So this is the third reason why we should not use the term backsliding. Relying on historical progress undermines the capacity of institutionalism to take responsibility for their ethical position. Backsliding stands for reasons that hides the responsibility of owning up to those. Ideologically, backsliding does the same job than talking about popular sovereignty does for the populists. It introduces a vision of the good without having to explain why it is good. When institutionalists say that they stand on the side of the good without giving reasons, they're actually conceding the point to the populists who believe that politics is not about reason, but about a show of force and numbers. So to conclude, institutionalists should not use backsliding because it ideologically connects democracy to the goals of commercial and finance global capitalism, aka neoliberalism, and because it implies that there are social hierarchies. And finally, we should not use backsliding because it takes away the responsibility of explaining the institutionalist ethical position. Now, so is this just about not using the word backsliding? No, it's not about, I'm sorry, I forgot my slides. No, it's not about not using the ideology of progress. The problems would not be solved if you use the term de-democratization, but kept all the other assumptions into place. Rather than using progress, institutionalists should be clear that they're against Caesarism, against the appropriation of popular sovereignty by a leader, that they are for checks and balances, for the protections of civil political rights, for the rights of religious minorities, for access to information, for transparency, for the possibility of making informed policy decisions without electoral pressures. They should be clear that they seek to protect the rights of women, independence of indigenous peoples, and most importantly, they should make clear their commitment to equality of all people present in the state's territory. Without the actual practical commitment to equality that is visible in politics, in the day-to-day organizational practices of institutionalists, it will remain easy to dismiss them as technocratic, neoliberal, and elitist. Only by committing by practice of equality, listening to others, engaging in the field, be willing to build politics from below, will the institutionalists find hard to mobilize and bring the majority on their side. Okay, thank you.
So we will open with questions from the audience. Just raise your hand. You first? Okay. Do you help me with this? Or I can go this.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Gamboa. My name is Ayu from University of Florida. So I find your categorization of strategies very insightful and interesting. I'm curious about what you think of the differentiation between violent and non-violent extra-institutional strategies. Would it be more effective if the opposition used non-violent extra-institutional strategies regardless the type of the goals? So empirically speaking, back to your case, the Venezuelan case, for example, whether the use of strikes and boycott be more successful if there was no coup before it. So what's more effective is the non-violent and violent strategies instead of the more than the goals. Yeah, that's. Thank you.
Perfect. Is it good? Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think there are two answers for that question. The first one is, I think we need to have a better discussion about what nonviolent protest entails in terms of organization, right? Like I think nowadays most demonstrations, most strikes are thought of as nonviolent, but because of the way these mobilizations are called upon and organized, there is a chance, a very high chance that there's fringe violence. And this is all about optics, right? And so regardless of whether the people call the, like, let me think about Black Lives Matter, right? Like nonviolent protests called nonviolent, and yet the pictures you see in the newspaper is the three people that burn a patrol, right? Now, is this the fault of the people calling for the protest? No. Do we probably need to think about better organization strategies that actually engage in what nonviolence means and what it entails? Probably. I think the second answer has to do with what I think. So I think there are two driving mechanisms, right? Like I think nonviolent protests might decrease sort of the ability of the autocrat to repress. But I still think that if they're seeking to remove the executive, and just keep in mind, I'm not talking about authoritarian regimes here. I'm talking about presidents that were democratically elected and deserve to finish their term. I think that if you're trying to just push a democratically elected president from the streets, that inevitably increases the stakes of the situation. It corners the president. It gives the president all sorts of incentives to respond back, right? So I do think that the goals matter for that.
I want to compliment all three of you. These were three fascinating papers. I'm going to ask a question to Laura because this is a subject that's closer to my heart, but I want to say that, you know, if we had the debate on backsliding, it would go on for 30 minutes, and we can't do that to the audience. And I want to say to Juan Pablo that the point on time was very, very interesting. But this is to Laura. And so do radical extra institutional forms of combating de-democratization actually reduce the costs of repression? Is that a fair assumption? Because the use of repression then takes the logic of competitive authoritarian rule and wrecks the kind of use of fake or of simulated democracy to legitimize non-legitimate rule by using naked violence. You know, it seems to me that public protest increases audience costs to the dictator. And so I'm wondering if the use of Venezuela as the case to illustrate that is maybe not a fair case because of the extra resources Chavez had from the oil and gas revenues. So he got very unpopular at moments, but then the resource cycle reversed, and all of a sudden he had revenues and he could use material gains to re-equilibrate his rule. So is, in some sense, could you be making the wrong assumption? And if so, is it because of the case you're using to illustrate that logic? And by the way, for a first project, this is so awesome, I have to say. It's a great design and a great idea.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about competitive authoritarian regimes. I'm not talking about authoritarian regimes. I think the sort of the costs and scope condition, the scope condition of my argument is for democracies. And I do not consider Venezuela to be a competitive authoritarian regime until after 2006. I think Venezuela had minimally free and fair elections up until 2006. And in the book, I explain at length why I think that. I think that Venezuela did have a lot of resources. Chavez did not have a hold over those resources until 2003. We're talking almost 5 years after almost 4 years after Chavez came to power, right? Chavez was able to get a hold of those resources because he was able to purge the armed forces, get a hold of the armed forces, and then use the armed forces to put PDVSA back up and running during the strike, and then fire 60% of PDVSA employees after the strike. And he was able to do all of this without losing his democratic facade, because at the end of the day, what these moves do is that they create a very murky situation, which takes me to the next point. I think the one important scope condition that was very true for Venezuela and Colombia in the early 2000s, I think is a little more complicated today, is the idea of an international community with a normative preference for democracy, right? So I think this is an important condition. We can talk about more of that if you have questions, but I think in principle, the sort of the thought I have behind me is for Chavez to just purge the armed forces in 1999 would have been impossible. That just was a non-starter. For Chavez to get a hold of PDVSA in 1999, not only was a non-starter, he actually tried several times and he wasn't able to. Like these institutions are really hard to peel down. And so I do think that Venezuela does have oil resources, and those resources came in handy after 2004, no doubt about that, but it wasn't until 2004. And it was sort of the opposition mistakes, in my opinion and according to my research, that gave the ability to Chavez to use those resources effectively.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Ana from UF. I'm doing my master in Latin American Studies. And the question is for Dr. Gamboa. So what would you say for someone that could bring up a criticism in the sense of, well, you were talking about the agency of the opposition, seeing them as actively making decisions that could lead to erosion, but not taking consideration that instead of being active decisions are more active decisions, more reactive decisions. So the criticism against the agency itself of the opposition itself, in criticism in the sense of maybe it sounds more kind of victim blaming when you say that the opposition is at fault. And then another thing that I wanted to mention is, have you taken in consideration in your case studies of Venezuela, have you taken in consideration Chavez's background in the military and his time as an instructor in the army, and how that could not necessarily the like how they say in Latin America, limpiando casa, or like cleaning house, that happened after the coup, but it's a process that began kind of beforehand, before he actually got to power, and that relationship between him and the military itself. So to summarize what I was asking, so I just want to ask you, so your response to some criticism that are saying you're victim blaming the opposition, seeing them as actively making decisions instead of reactively making those decisions, and then taking into consideration President Chavez background as a military himself and his role in the military beforehand, and how that impacted the response.
So in the book, I am very clear about this. In the presentation, I was not. I think oppositions facing these autocrats are facing sophist choices. They are facing incredibly hard, difficult situations. Definitely the autocrat is the autocrat, right? Like, I guess my call or my book is more about thinking about this guy's in power. Now, what were we gonna do about it, right? Like, it's in power. There's nothing we can do about it. Chavez was elected. There's nothing we can do about that. So like, more than, it's not that I'm denying the fact that these people are autocrats and polarizing and using all kinds of tricks and like and taking advantage of all sorts of things. It's more like thinking, in those conditions, how do we fight back, right? So it's not that I think that the erosion of democracy is the fault of the opposition, is that I think that the opposition can make, or we can learn from opposition mistakes to make better decisions down the road. So that's on the victim blaming conversation. On Chavez's background, yes, absolutely. Chavez had a strong background in the military. It was, however, a reduced group inside the military. And what you see throughout mostly the 2000s, 2001, and sort of early 2002 is a very active, especially military officials, literally standing in the Plaza of Altamira saying, we want to get rid of the president. Like, this was very vocal. It was very open. People who were living there at the time talked about how this military would go to reunions, and talking about the coup was talking about yesterday's dinner, right? And so I'm not saying everybody inside the military was against Chavez. As a matter of fact, the military brought him back after the coup. But I do think that the opposition had the upper hand within the armed forces. And definitely, yes, Chavez was trying to, like, Chavez wasn't dummy, right? Like, he was trying to figure out mechanisms to get rid of people he didn't like inside the armed forces. I just think this would have taken significantly more effort, and it would have been significantly harder without the coup. It wouldn't have been as fast or as easy to do it. Especially, Chavez would have had to sacrifice a lot of his democratic facade, right? Like, I think it would have been a harder trade-off to do. Thank you for the question, though.
I will use my authoritarian powers now to ask for question for the other papers. So, Tim, do you have a question for other papers? Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Tim. I'm a PhD student here at UF. I study political theory. So this question's for Dr. Ochoa Espejo. So I was wondering if you could relate this paper that you presented today to your book on the time of popular sovereignty, and specifically sort of relate this paper to the ontological questions that you asked. So for instance, is the discourse of backsliding related to the sort of wrong ontological conceptions of the people as like a unitary reality that lacks sort of, as a unitary potency that lacks reality in need of representation, or something along those lines?
So I'm sorry, I would like to bring it back to the paper because most people may not know. But what I do talk about in the book is that when one talks about the people, you are, of course, trying to legitimize government using the idea of the people, but the idea of the people depends on the power of representation, whether a leader is making a people, or one sees that as a thing, as an object that exists in a given moment in time, or if one sees it as something that changes over time. So when I'm proposing in the book that you see the people as a process over time that may involve contestation. So it is the people. You can talk about popular sovereignty, but you can't say that it is the people now and it will remain the people as it is. It requires contestation. So what I see in the idea of backsliding is that the process is open. So backsliding would close the process because it's always going in that direction. You already know what's going to happen. So some traditional views of the Enlightenment that are still present would be a liberal, like say Habermas, or a traditional liberal that says, we already know who's going to win because in the force of the better argument, my side will win because we are right. So we don't even have to go through the discussion because we already know that we are going to win. Democracy is right. I don't think that you can say that. I think that the process has to actually play out. So that would be the connection here. What I'm saying is that if you imply that democracy will win, that somehow reason is embedded in history and the right side is going to win, you, in a way, you're already lost because you don't let democracy play out. You're closing off the opportunities for democracy to play out. You're giving it to those who think that you don't, that the reasons are already given. So that's how I would connect it if I had to.
Oh, sorry. Whose turn is it? I also have questions for, since I'm following the guidelines of the moderator. I loved, Paulina, I loved your paper. And I just want to ask you, like, do you think the fundamental problem here is how we're defining democracy and making it too much about some sort of abstract principles, or even just voting as sort of like the thing that defines democracy versus defining it as its actual results for equality, for the conditions in which people are living? And then my question for Juan Pablo is about sort of like why all these parties are disappearing, understanding more about sort of the cycle of parties appearing and disappearing. And do you think a bipolar political system or a multi-party system is better for democracy or for the actual concrete results that it brings for citizens?
If you imagine democracy as something that is already given or something that you already know how it looks like, then it's very easy to be very depressed because things are clearly not going in that direction. So, you know, like when Pablo ended up saying like, good luck, you know, it's like definitely not going there. So I think that we have that tendency, as we were discussing yesterday, to imagine politics in a space. And we imagine it in a left-right continuum because of the French Revolution, but we tend to imagine it in a field, right? That's how we imagine it in space. We also imagine it in space in terms of national states. But I think that the practice of democracy nowadays, there's a lot of local politics and very small level activity, self-organizing groups that create a lot of democratic movement. There's a lot of that happening all over the world. And it doesn't look very hopeful because it doesn't look like it's going on its way to conquering the state. And we tend to think that unless it conquers the state, it's not going anywhere. But I do think that there are like a lot of connections being like transnational or translocal connections being made among these local groups. And that would be another way of framing, like you were talking about different spaces. So if we concentrated, for example, on all of those local movements that are happening across the world for like water defenders, for example, or different like local conditions or like neighborhood associations and that kind of stuff, you see a lot of democratic vibrancy, if you will. And it might be going in that direction and we haven't seen because we haven't been paying attention to that.
Thanks for the question. Let me try to like come back to Paulina, which I think it's very it's great to have listened to this paper. I think when we try to understand why parties are disappearing in the region, we often focus on politicians or what the people is voting and voting wrongly. And I think what you see today in the region is like 40 years of democracy without much performance and delivery, right? And this doesn't have much to do with politicians or the voters. In my view, it has more to do with the structural conditions in which the states we have, the economies and the political economies that we have, the type of societies and demography that we have, right, make that delivery and that performance fade away, right? And at the same time, you have people like Bukele, which can perform, can market what that performance and provide and fulfills needs that people feel that democracy didn't fulfill, right? And this comes back to Paulina, right? So we are defending democracy in terms of our normative adherence to this regime and its promise, but this promise is broken for the people a long time ago. We have to face that, right? And I would like to just draw an implication of what Paulina just said. I think that by sticking to this normative preference for democracy, we are also self-imposing ourselves not to find ways to improve democracy or search for new institutional arrangement that might make democratic ideals or egalitarian ideals work in societies as the ones we have today in the or in the world.
Mauro.
Thank you. Amazing panel. Had so much to ask. I will not monopolize the question here, but very quickly, Paulina, always bothered me, the term backsliding. I always felt a sense of what was wrong, and you articulated it so in an elegant way. I was going to ask you, to what extent are not racial, gender, class hierarchy inscribed in that normative point from the beginning? So, right, for example, if you read Charles Mill's The Racial Contract, right, he demonstrates that notions of barbarian and civilized world are centered on racial hierarchies, right? If you read Hannah Pitkin's book, very interesting book on Machiavelli, you see that all that Machiavelli's concept of fortuna is always represented by a woman who is tricky, who is deceiving, right? And virtue is always a male feature, right? A masculine. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that the normative aspects of political thinking that you are analyzing have always been grounded in racial, gender hierarchies. And that reflects on how we frame easily and in a very problematic way the contemporary political movements, right? So I have zero sympathy for Amalo's political project, not that this is relevant, but what I would guess is that the picture that you showed about the recent protest, the participants would be overwhelmingly, compared to Amalo's support base, more white, middle, upper class, right? And so, and often critique of those who don't understand the importance of democracy, don't understand the importance of what they're saying, is also dismissive in terms of class gender and racial hierarchies, right? Not only the Native Americans, but also the Black and their descendants. And so I thought, if you thought about that from the region of political thinking, right? And that ties to the other, I think that Laura, you are in the right track. If you read all these discussions about why democracies die, it's all related about how the elites didn't react when they could, about these threats. And instead, you're looking at and make a contribution to say how the opposition acted has a huge impact on the outcome. And I fully support that. But again, it's the normative aspect, right? We could call Chavez, instead of a potential autocrat, we could call him a potential democrat, right? Because at the core here is the strongly elitist democracy that existed in Venezuela with Ponto Fijo agreement that was extremely exclusionary of, including, there were aspects of racial hierarchies there that were very clear about, always portraying Chavez supporters as barbarians, as primitive, stigma. There is one chapter in David Smart's book about Venezuela that has all the representations of Chavistas as illiterate, stupid, Black and brown people who don't understand the opposition, right? So anyway, the panel was excellent, and just wanted to share these questions.
I just want to say something very quickly. When you think about the drivers of these oppositions, which is kind of what I'm thinking right now, I think an important part of this is recognizing the forces that bring these potential autocrats. I do think there are potential autocrats to power. That doesn't mean that that they come in a vacuum, right? Like, I think they come in challenging, incredibly, like in unequal societies, right? Like, and I think that also for the right wing autocrats, like, I think in general they latch into inequalities in society or perceived inequalities in society, and I think a good process of opposing them is recognizing what brought them to power in the first place, right? Recognizing that, I mean, yes, I disagree with Alvaro Uribe. I voted against the guy. I protested against the guy. But at the same time, Colombia did have a serious problem of security. And people in the countryside, not in Bogota where I lived, were dying, right? Yes, Hugo Chavez came to power, and yes, he destroyed democratic institutions. But yeah, he also came to power because the other people were completely unresponsive to what was going on, right? Evo Morales, which is a contested one that I always get pushback on, right? He came to power and brought into the political arena a huge segment of society that had never been part of it, right? And I think we need to grapple with these things as well. I still think that getting rid of democratic institutions is a bad idea. Like, I'll stand on that hill, but I do think that that doesn't undermine the fact that we need to recognize what brings these leaders to power. And even now, when I talk to opposition in Venezuela today, I still see it. They still don't see it. They don't see why is that Chavez came to power. They don't see the audiences. Like, it's just like really hard for them to look at it. So I it's not that I don't think that they come to power in a vacuum and stuff like that.
Hello, thank you. My question is for Dr. Ochoa Espejo. My name is Carlos. I'm a student in the Masters of Latin American Studies department. My question is, first off, I really enjoyed your paper and that connection that you made between the sort of paternalism of the Spanish as they were colonizing the America, this idea that they had to proselytize sort of virtue, and the religious connotations of democracy is something that's oftentimes the ideological implications aren't questioned. And sort of my question is, this relationship of paternalism and democracy, do you see that perhaps relating to other interventions that have taken place in Latin America, particularly thinking of democracy as almost something to be proselytized in that same sort of religious and missionary sense? It seems to me that that rhetoric of paternalism has been used before, whether it was in Haiti or in Chile, to justify a lot of intervention, this idea that democracy is something that's too important to just allow people to make this choice. We have to sort of get involved ourselves. And perhaps this moves beyond the scope of the paper, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that a little bit more.
I just wanted to remind people that there's that aspect of it, you know, that you touch a nerve that there are nerves that are touched when you're saying that people are ignorant and that's why they don't defend your side. And so that when you touch those nerves, then you might be having a bad public relations, because I don't think that it's wrong. I actually think that they are good reasons to defend democracy. I think that a lot of people take those reasons for granted and are not willing to talk about them, that they start too far along their path of their discussion, and in doing so, they lose a whole bunch of people. A whole bunch of people that already lost faith in institutions and are not willing to give you the light of day. So, I mean, I actually do want democracy to win, but they have to fight it. They, you know, like they have to get majorities on their side. So I just wanted to remind people of all that baggage.
Thank you. So thank you so much. It was very nice to hear you. It's for Paulina and Juan Pablo. So I kept thinking while you were answering the questions now that you are both bringing inequality somehow to the table, right? So what happens, what effectively happens to people matters. What democracy effectively delivers matters. And Juan Pablo was talking about how states have become weaker and the challenges to the states have become more and more difficult and stronger. And I think this also has to do with how the state functions under a context. And then you have not used the word of a certain pattern of capitalist functioning of the world, right? So don't we have to talk about capitalism if we want to discuss why democracy does not deliver and what kind of democracy we could defend as delivering something? Don't we need, I'm thinking of the political science as a field, don't we need like a stronger criticism of how democracy and capitalism, you know, go hand in hand in ways that will not deliver for the majority of the population? So.
Go ahead.
Yes. I don't want to talk about I'm sorry. So why don't I talk about capitalism? I think that just like backsliding or even democracy or populism, capitalism does too much and does too little, because capitalism means too much at one time. So I do talk about economic growth because economic growth refers to a particular theory of development that was put forward in the 20th century to go hand in hand with the political objectives of the North. But if you talk about economic development, it's not, or for example, when people say like capitalism, what does that mean? All markets? I'm not against all markets. You know, I may be against unregulated, like transnational financial rapacious markets, but there might be some other markets that I'm perfectly happy with. But when people begin to talk about capitalism, they run together all sorts of things that make it hard to have a conversation. Moreover, a lot of socialists and for certain like classical Marxists are on the side of progress, and those are not the things that I like. So if you just criticize capitalism, it sounds like, what is the alternative? Are you like endorsing like Marxist versions of socialism? Not really. I mean, my concern is about the notion, at least in this paper, is about the notion of progress that goes hand in hand with economic development. And so if I just criticize capitalism, I'm just like, it's like using an enormous machine to have like a delicate operation. It's too big to talk about the kind of things that I want to talk about. But I do think in terms of neoliberalism, or what became associated with neoliberalism, and particularly with the theory of development of the second part of the 20th century.
I agree, and I think we had too much of autonomy of politics, and like part of like political scientists, I would say professional affirmation had to do with claiming that politics was relatively autonomous from societal structures, and I think we have to re-embed politics in society to understand what's going on, and that includes systems of production. I would also would like to say that talking about capitalism should not be talking about state versus market, right? This discussion is completely, I would say, out of time, right? So part of what we are seeing, in my view, in terms of like discontent in Latin America has to do with discontent with the state. So if we have and this was what Gabriel was arguing for Milei today, right? I mean, if you have a left that is arguing we need more state to control the market or to tame the market or to redistribute, people's experience with the state is a state that is captured by from the top and from the bottom by interest that make state action go against the preferences of the popular sectors. So I think this is also a problem for the left. Which type of political economy are we going to like push for, right? There are some ideas, for instance, in the Consortium for Social Progress that Amartya Sen put together, and it's now producing some new stuff. But essentially what they claim is Scandinavian social democracy is gone. There are some ideas here. Let's see how we can deal with this, right? So we are at a loss, I think, in terms of like really engaging with capitalism, right? And the other thing I would say, and this it's more related to the work I'm doing now, it's an important fraction and an increasing fraction of capitalism in Latin America has to do with illegal enterprises and the relationship between illegal and legal enterprises. You cannot do money in illegal markets without making them enter the legal political economy. And if you want to understand capitalism, economic growth, social progress in Latin America, you have to understand how these illegal economies bring together social progress, for instance, and we have to deal with it.
So now that we hear everyone in the table, feel free to ask Laura questions again. But we have a question back there. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ana, master student in Latin American Studies. I have a question to Laura Gamboa, right? I would like to know more about what do you think about the difference between Colombia and Venezuela in these two cases, because Venezuela continue with the same regime about Hugo Chavez Frias, and Colombia with Álvaro Uribe Vélez. Right now, Colombia, after protests, has a new government toward to the left. What do you think about it? Because you explain about these two countries, but I would like to know more about what is the big difference between these two countries in the case that one of them had many protests as Venezuela did, but they continue with the same government. And Colombia, after a protest in 2020, we turned to the left.
So talking about the rise of Gustavo Petro is an entire different paper, but this is what I will say. I think again, like I think my book discusses Venezuela up until 2006. Starting in 2006, it's a whole different game because the government it doesn't care about democratic facility. It's going to repress. It's going to put out the military. It's just a whole different game. I am very hesitant to say that Gustavo Petro came to power because of the protests, and there are two reasons for that. A, Gustavo Petro loves to say that the protests were led by him. They were not. He jumped on top of those. These were spontaneous protests that had many, many reasons, some of which just Petro capitalized, right? I also think that Gustavo Petro's rise to power has to do with reasons that come well before the protest and has to do with the end or the signature of the peace agreements and the fact that all of a sudden Colombia, which was a country in which politics was debated around the armed conflict. Like if you go back in time, every single election in Colombia was about what are we going to do with the armed conflict, right? Starting in 2018, all of a sudden, all of these other topics about socioeconomic inequality and stuff like that were kind of in the backseat start to emerge in the political arena. And that is an arena in which the sort of the traditional elites and the traditional right had no gain. Gustavo Petro, on the other hand, was ready to take advantage of that new space. Whether he's taking advantage of his presidency or not is something we can discuss over coffee.
From what I can tell from most, if not all, the speculations and assumptions presented here today are constructed with the idea or the assumption that these processes operate independently of outside influence and intervention, most notably that of the United States of America, which has a long history of overt and covert intervention in the internal affairs of Latin American countries, usually in the form of propping up authoritarian regimes and acting to undermine genuinely democratic governments in accordance with its own purely selfish objectives. So my question is, how can neglecting this aspect of Latin American political history bring us any closer to understanding the history that is happening in those countries at this very moment?
I think that at this moment, actually, the United States tends to learn a lot of what is happening here in Latin America. I think that in the current political moment in the United States, it might be exactly the opposite, and not that we are neglecting to see what the United States bring to the conversation, but it might be exactly the opposite, that the United States would stand to learn a lot of what is happening in Latin America. And one more thing, I did mention part of what the influence of the United States in the region has done. I think part of the discussion, what I mentioned is that the model of growth, the stages of economic growth was a model that was actually imposed by the international economic institutions and US aid, pretty much. So to that extent is something that is mentioned. But I also recently, well, not recently, but there was the last coup in Bolivia, and I was giving a talk, sort of talking about more or less to the students in my school about what was going on. And they all insisted that it must be the United States. And I was like, you know, like it might be, but we are perfectly capable of giving ourselves coups, you know? We don't necessarily need the United States to act. There's some things that happen in the region that are independent of the United States. And I do want to insist on that one. You know, there is some independence. Although the United States always loom large, there is some leeway of having discussions that do not directly involve the United States that would still be rich, I hope.
I just can say one thing and its caveat. I think at this moment we are fortunate that the U.S. doesn't care as much as it did on about Latin America, right? With one exception, which is the DEA, right? And I think the prohibitionist regime imposed and like pushed for by the U.S. Is behind the homicidal the epidemic of homicides we see in the region. And that creates also a constituency for people that like outsiders that claim that they can solve the security crisis. Right? So if I had to point at one particular influence in the region today, I would point at that.
I want to endorse what Paulina say. I've encountered this conversation a lot, and I have to say we have agency too. It's not like the CIA playing the lines. Yes, they have done immense harm. I don't doubt that, but there's some agency on this side of the hemisphere as well. I also want to say two things. I think so. In my two cases, as a matter of fact, Álvaro Uribe had the full endorsement of the United States, the entire government. It's failed in eroding democracy. On the contrary, Hugo Chavez had the United States opposing it very actively, especially at the beginning, and yet Hugo Chavez succeeded in eroded democracy. So that's something to give it think about. And then the other thing I'll say is I think the one thing in which I think is very important is I'm of the tendency of the side that thinks that there has been changes on the United States normative preference for democracy. I think this has changed over time. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. And I think when the United States has a normative preference for democracy, autocrats have a less leeway to function. We were discussing earlier about El Salvador. And one of the things that I think helped Nayib Bukele be so quick in eroding democracy is the fact that when he went into Congress with the army, there was no international reaction. Why? Because Donald Trump wasn't interested in democracy. He was interested in immigration, and Nayib Bukele, and so do every single Central American leader, and in many other ways, other leaders, they know how to play this interest. They know how to figure this out. So if anything, I think in many ways, the Central American leaders in particular have played the US in very efficient ways to get what they want. And so I think that that's the one thing that I would say. I think one of the important things from the US in particular, but I also sort of the international community more broadly, is a normative preference for democracy that creates this need to keep a democratic facade. And I think that helps us slow down things.
Any other question? I have 2 minutes.
Yeah, it will be very, very short. When we were organizing the title of this conference, we had a long conversation about getting rid of the title Backsliding. So what will be your proposal, Paulina? Because the idea that we wanted to convey is that democracy is in dispute, right? And that some people are trying to improve it, to radicalize it, while other people are trying to limit it, including social movements and citizens. So we just had such a long title that we decided, okay, let's stick to backsliding that it's used in the political science literature.
It'd be fun for us to think about it because, I mean, it could be democratization and de-democratization, but again, it implies that there's only one direction for it to go, and there's either forth or back. When there's like, where is it going? You know, that where are these processes leading? What term would convey that? You know, creative powers, you know, what's the right term to convey that? I like to bring back what matters about democracy, which is the liberal principle of equality, which I think that would go back. But of course, we don't want to have the conference on equality because that would be completely different, right? It would not be this. But what are the processes of what? I get it. I mean, it might be that the term is there to stay, but it's just interesting to know what it conveys.
So we are on time. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much to all the presenters. It was a very good discussion. Thank you so much.